incarnation of trying to rally the troops. He loses some of the troops. Jeff Mason, Reuters White House correspondent with us, Justin Wallin, GOP pollster. Jeff, on that and the drip, 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 that's what the White House likes to emphasize, that it's just a drip, drip, drip. It's hardly a jailbreak. How do you see it?
Well, I think the way you characterize it is probably spot on, Neil. They're not happy to see lawmakers coming out and to see these calls, be it from people in races where they think that having Biden on the ticket is going to affect their ability to win, up to, of course, that op-ed from George Clooney last week, or I guess it was still this week, a few days ago, and the tepid comments from former Speaker Nancy Pelosi. They're all unwelcome, and yet President Biden, I think, is responding to that in a few different ways. One is to make those calls that you were referring to, and the other is to do what he did last night at that rally, which I was at, and I would share the conclusion that I think many others had from being in that room. This guy isn't going anywhere. It's not that it doesn't matter that these calls are coming. I think he takes them seriously, but he's not drawing a conclusion from those calls that they are right. Or that these people, these lawmakers, these Democratic strategists, it doesn't matter who they are seeing the campaign or the race in the correct way. He sees it in a different way. He sees himself as the one who can win, despite that debate performance, which kicked this entire crisis off.
It's a good point, all good points. And Justin, to pursue that, he might be looking at the polls. I'm going to go through all the recent ones, because some people say, oh, you show a poll that indicates something and then the other one doesn't. These are the recent polls just since this whole debate fiasco. And the fact of the matter is it's a tight race. In a couple of these polls, Joe Biden has an edge, or it's just, outright dead even. So with all his hassles, he can go back to Democrats who are considering bolting. I'm still in it to win it. What do you make of that?
Well, it's true on a national stage. I mean, the polls still are extremely tight. There's no doubt about that. However, there is weakness underlying those polls. When you start to look at those different questions of, well, should the president stay in the race or leave? 2/3 say he should leave. That includes about a majority of Biden supporters. Those are massive numbers. And when you start to look at other components that are critical in a national race, which of course are swing states, of the 7 core swing states, we now see that in 5, former President Trump has expanded his lead to outside the margin of error, so around 5% or so. That's meaningful. That's real. And I would say that, drips matter in tight races. Tight political races are iterative. And all of those little things start to add up. So yes, what catches the news is George Clooney says, I'm out, I think he should leave. But what's behind all of that is your other major donors. Are they giving as much? Are they giving as regularly? And then eventually, as we get up close to the election, it's going to impact the volunteer class. Who's actually going door to door to get folks out to vote on Election Day who may not be that enthused absent that knock? All of these things matter. All of this is part of the fabric, and it has a real impact.
It's clearly having a real impact on some of these 19 Democrats, Jeff, who aren't keen on these developments, particularly when they say, all right, the down ticket impact. I had a chance to speak to Illinois Democrat Brad Schneider, who echoed that with me earlier in the week. I'd like you to listen to this, Jeff, and then respond to it. Brad Schneider.
As I look to the future and where we're going, I see we have a moment that I am calling on the president to make the heroic choice to pass the baton to the next generation. And if I put it in context, it's exactly what George Washington did after his second term.
Nothing the president said yesterday convinced you to change your mind?
No, because it's not about a single press conference or a debate or a campaign event. It's about where are we going and who's best positioned to lead us.
Now, he's just among those who put his name out there. The guy's got to go. But what's interesting, Jeff, is there are many others who feel that way. They just haven't announced it. So where do you think this is going?
Well, you're right. And I think that means that there may be or are likely to be more announcements in the coming days, possibly coming weeks. The president has a short window, either to win people over or to just hang on. And that short window is a few weeks before the virtual nomination process that his party is planning to do before the convention. We don't have an exact date on that yet, but it's likely to be at the end of this month. The Democratic convention, of course, is in August. That could still be a raucous intra-party fight there, but he is likely to have the nomination sealed up, which is to say the vote of the delegates actually taken by then. So for the people in the party who really want to get him off the ticket, they only have a few weeks as well. And so that's, I guess, a long way of saying, Neil, I think we're going to hear more. I think you're going to have more criticisms. You're going to have more calls for him to step aside. And on the flip side, you're going to have him going out there and doing interviews like Monday with Lester Holt of NBC, doing his speech at the LBJ library, trying to draw a contrast with President Trump. Last night at that rally, you heard him, I think for the first time, lay out what his agenda would be for the first 100 days of his second term. So he's out there being aggressive, trying to attack the people in his own party while drawing that contrast with Donald Trump. And it's just TBD as to whether or not it's going to work.
Yeah, too early to tell, but we shall see. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both. I apologize for all the breaking news and keeping things truncated here.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.